We've arrived at the inauguration of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris this week. And I'll admit, it feels both historic and important, but also a little bit anticlimactic. Trump exits with a second impeachment tag to his legacy, but given the anything but civil transfer of power, all we can say is that one long national nightmare is now over, while many others still remain. Emboldened white supremacists, millions questioning the legitimacy of our democracy, violent insurrections on the streets and in our capital, climate change and science denialism, and the gross mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic.
The four P's: professional, political, practical, personal.
That last one kind of stings. And COVID vaccine deployment and rollout. It's just a few weeks in, but it's clearly been a mess with massive supply and distribution issues, inconsistencies all across the country, appointment cancellations, and no coordinated federal government leadership and strategy. Now, some may blame local and state officials or hospital and medical leaders, but this is the last massive failure of the Trump administration. Make no mistake. There was no plan for how to prioritize and coordinate this, and cleaning it up is going to take months, if not longer. And then you hear and read about big companies secretly trying to get massive supplies of the vaccine on the secondary market so that its employees can return to work. Fortunately, those attempts were unsuccessful, but it speaks to a much bigger problem, maybe the biggest problem in our society. Something practical. I'll never forget the first time I read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations as a freshman in college. It was the mid-90s. The United States was still riding high off of its 1-0 victory in the Cold War. Bill Clinton was on the verge of a landslide re-election. Belief in capitalism was, as a pillar of the global economy, was at an all-time high. The dot-com bubble was still several years away from imploding. And I had just gotten my first ATM card with Mellon Bank in Philadelphia. Now, fast forward 25 years later, and it's clear that the free market economy is, well, problematic. Now, I get it. Cue the cries of socialism. Now, for those who have forgotten, and for the many more who never even read it, The Wealth of Nations touched upon the division of labor, productivity, and free markets. It continues to serve as a foundation for modern economic and social thought. But it's also misinterpreted, as are terms like capitalism and socialism and free market. Now, the free market is an economic system based on supply and demand with little or no government control. And in recent decades, a whole set of economic ideas, often supporting the free market, have come to be hugely influential on how we make policies and even how we think. Ideas like game theory and public choice theory and free rider thinking have all combined to make a crudely selfish view of the world seem like the norm. One thing no one debates or questions, however, is the fact that wealth inequality is real and perhaps the single biggest issue plaguing society today. There's always been a gap between the haves and the have-nots, but that gap is getting larger at an accelerated pace. Inequality follows something called a fractal distribution. It's just like the stock market and snowflakes, right? What it means is, like, if you look at an entire nation's income and see that the richest 1% gain around 20% of the income, scale invariance would mean that if you zoom in on that richest 1%, then the top percent of that 1% have 20% of the income, and so on as you zoom in. But inequality is not an inevitability. Over the last 30 to 40 years, inequality has only risen in countries that introduced economic policies heavily favoring free markets, like the US and the UK. It's not happening everywhere. So why does our society and social culture deify those who have created or even tolerated such inequality, or worse, encourage it? Just look at those who advocate for decreasing top-tier tax rates in the US. The answer is greed. Now, those who lack wealth strive to achieve it. Those who have wealth want more of it. Now, community and individual health and social justice and civil rights, all of these issues stem from our growing inequality. So as we inaugurate a new phase of American leadership and manage to hopefully get COVID back under control, it's imperative that we look at the sources of and solutions to the radical inequality that underlies so many of these other challenges.
When our dishwasher stopped working, we were one click away. At Lowe's.com, getting a new dishwasher delivered right to our house was never easier. Only at Lowe's.
Something political. And that inequality is going to be just one of the issues immediately facing the Biden administration. Late last week, President-elect Biden presented his plan for a $2 trillion relief package, which put vaccination, individual financial relief as the top of his priorities for the first 100 days in office, although it'll likely take a lot longer to solve most of those issues. It's not going to erase the 400,000 American deaths to date either, but better testing, guidance for schools, help and support for local governments, and just disaster relief overall will tackle the pandemic in a way that we have not yet seen to date. Yet GOP lawmakers are already criticizing the plan, calling it too big and too much. This attempt to deflect attention from the Capitol riots and other failures is just a diversion away from any attempt at achieving unity under a new president. But perhaps more important than the updated plan itself is the new tone of leadership rooted in empathy. Every day matters, every person matters, Biden has said. Now, the last time our nation was in such peril and required transformational social leadership and management and execution was when FDR was elected to office during the Great Depression. The New Deal was the most expansive, coordinated federal effort to lift a nation out of a hole, and it worked. The New Deal put people to work, but it also regulated how much the wealthy class could profit from the measures enacted. Now, government intervention saved America. Over the last 40 years, big government became a rallying cry for conservatives, and here we are again. Business executives have held top positions in government these past 4 years and lost sight of the very principles upon which our government of, by, and for the people were founded. Whereas most Americans once agreed that government regulation, social welfare programs, and investments in infrastructure were critical, our current division is no longer split this way. There are as many, if not more, impoverished Americans who are voting in opposition to their own best interest. White supremacists aside, activist government does more to help more Americans, plain and simple. This is not a bad thing, and we need to reclaim it as a dirty term. President Biden has advocated for a fair economy for all, focusing on an idea of community that highlights the needs of people of color, minorities, women, children. So it's on the rest of us to keep that pressure on, keep pushing, and bring America back out of the darkness. It's the 4Ps episode 140, something personal, and 140 is a special number. And as many of you know, because it was the first Twitter character limit and a number that will always be associated with the digital communication and media network. Now, personally and professionally, I've got a very rich history with Twitter. As one of the earliest social marketing agency leads, I pushed big global brands onto Twitter as early as 2008. Now, for me, it was both a passion project and a fun challenge, convincing these brands and the marketers of the viability of the platform as a long-term investment. A few years later, after we won the Kraft Mondelez business, my first priority was to convert @TheOreoCookie into a well-known feed. But in order to do that, they'd have to change the handle to @Oreo, right? Obvious. Unfortunately, that long inactive username belonged to the Japanese owner of a dead cat named Oreo. And back then, you could just pick up the phone and call Twitter's small but great partnership team. It took some work, but we finally got things transferred over to @Oreo. 2 years later, our team pushed out a tweet during the Super Bowl that changed digital marketing forever. Some may argue not for the better. There was also the time when ghostwriting for Ryan Seacrest tweets on behalf of @Coca-Cola, we accidentally waded into the late night television host debate. There was the time I created a brand's new Twitter handle for a major global brand and ran it for like 6 months before we even told them about it. There were countless times when a colleague or a boss or my wife or someone else in my network implored me to delete an ill-advised post. There was also the time that a quote of mine in the New York Times about Twitter's new video ad options was cut short, and the entire global Twitter leadership team was basically calling for my head. Undeterred, I'm pushing 36,500 tweets now, most of which could be used against me in some way if I were ever to become famous. But it remains the best tool for expressing, communicating, and learning about the world outside our homes. Twitter has remained a second-tier marketing platform for over a decade, but is the platform for entertainment and cultural moments and second-screen conversations. Some may argue that President Trump pushed Twitter to new levels of engagement, and that may be true. But when used properly and fairly, there is no healthier place for discourse. But anonymous trolls and bots and pockets of hateful, violent rhetoric have also contributed to significant social and civil deterioration. On the bright side, 10 plus years of prodding later, my wife is not only active on Twitter, she's passionately engaging Real Housewives Twitter, medical Twitter, COVID Twitter, as well as engaging anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, and pro-Trump morons with a vigor beyond even my own levels of rancor. So I can now say, Twitter, my work here is complete. And finally this week, something professional, but also personal. For as long as I can remember, professional working women have been at the center of my life. My own mother returned to work 2 months after I was born, and she hasn't slowed down since. And even as I write this, my wife is seeing patients, working weekends, finding new ways to help her patient population, fielding phone calls, the occasional telemed visit, while balancing motherhood and doctorhood. Working mothers are a fundamental pillar of our social, economic, and family structures. But that balance hasn't gotten any easier. They face challenges that no one else faces in the workplace, and things that we can't even really fathom if we're not working moms. It's something I've been especially attuned to since entering the workforce more than 2 decades ago. And while it may feel strange or presumptuous for me to speak to or about working motherhood, and while I probably have made my share of mistakes as a manager over the years, I can never truly understand the challenges that women face in the workplace. But this conversation is crucial. Traditional gender roles have provided men with greater flexibility to prioritize their job above all else. But we all have smartphones and laptops, which creates the perception of availability. And that's not always a good thing. No matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, you could be called or emailed or pinged, and that creates, potentially, an expectation. It's an understatement to say that the line between professional life and personal life, for most of us, have been blurred. The blueprint for a better work-life relationship requires striking a balance. Yet, too many managers and leaders struggle with how to best play a positive, productive, supportive role in the careers, growth, and development of and for working mothers. Now, to their credit, more and more companies are eager to implement work-life flexibility, but there's often insufficient guidance on how to do one's work in less time to make that balance easier or better. I don't profess to have all the solutions, but I try to start with just an employee-centric focus. Being transparent and open and supportive, it's the bedrock of all this, both for employees and for managers. When we encourage employees to consider and define what they want to achieve, we can then better plan and support them in their commitment to their vision for how to find this balance. We can acknowledge and reward the courage of professional moms by asking what they need and helping adapt a work environment that supports them. Of course, we all need to learn and understand federal and state laws and company policies, but when people come first, the company culture forges greater loyalty, individual commitment, and team success. And when that happens, we all win.